Speed is relative. As they say, one man's horsepower is the next man's lack of horsepower. Triumph Speed Twin, more like Triumph Slow Twin. Okay, today we're looking at retro motorcycles, modern classic motorcycles, whatever you want to call them, that are actually fast. These are the bikes that, for me, fall more in line with the bikes that they're emulating by really producing serious power. Often these are bikes that have had significant weight cuts. These are classically styled bikes with true modern performance, and listen, I'm all for that. I think it's awesome. I should also note that these are all bikes that you can actually buy right now. So I'm not including bikes like the recently unveiled prototype Norton V4CR, for example. Also, again, speed and power are relative, so I know some of these bikes are way too slow for some of you and way too fast for probably most of you. These are the bikes I think of when I think of retro motorcycles that are fast. So, without further ado, let's jump in. First up, we have the Indian FTR 1200, a bike that really came from a spirit of racing. Sure, it's not MotoGP racing, but it's still racing, flat track racing to be more specific. The FTR 1200 is based on the incredibly successful 750cc flat track racer from Indian. It has many of the same style cues, though I will say that original 750 that was produced as a limited edition bike is quite spicy. It was so expensive, but it's so cool. Regardless, the 1200 is obviously bigger, it's obviously a bit heavier, but it's quite powerful, producing 120 horsepower and weighing in at a claimed 512 pounds wet, which is lighter than a T120, for example, and obviously this is going to be significantly quicker as it's a lot more powerful. Now, this is a cool bike in this space, and it's not styled after the street bikes of the 60s and 70s like virtually every other retro bike, but instead, it is styled after the classic American flat trackers of the 50s and on. I would love to see Indian come out with a smaller production version of that 750 that they had. That's not just like a limited edition one. I want like a 750 that is made for the street and that is affordable, maybe under 10,000, maybe like 9,000. I think it would do fantastic, as the FTR 1200 is a bit pricey for most people, and it would be cool to see a smaller flat tracker that could compete with some of the other retro bikes that are more in that middleweight category. But regardless, the FTR 1200 is a pretty fast, pretty powerful bike. All right, next we have a retro bike that I haven't really talked about much in my videos, the BMW R9T range, making 109 horsepower at a nice low RPM of between 4,000 and 6,000. Though the R9T isn't entirely my cup of Jägermeister, I like that it is more of a take on retro aesthetic instead of a full-on copy like many of the other modern classics. It's retro-inspired more than just like trying to look classic. I know the power to weight isn't everything, especially when we're talking about overall rideability on the street, but regardless, the bike weighs in at about 489 pounds wet, which is really pretty solid for this segment. If you're looking for a refined, classic, modern motorcycle that can still hang with almost anything on the road, this might be the bike to get. I know many of you have an idea of what a retro motorcycle is, but when you take a step back and really define this segment and even recognize that the roots of this movement can actually be traced back to all sorts of different things. It's not just bikes made to look like the classic British bikes. You've got things like the Ducati Sport Classics. These were motorcycles that were absolutely not styled after the British bikes of the 60s and 70s. Anyways, you see that retro can mean a lot of things, and in this case, we're looking at the Suzuki Katana, essentially a redesign and reviving of a classic sport bike from the 80s. Now, I don't want to go on for too long about this bike or even about the original Katana, but it's really not for me in terms of style. That doesn't mean it's not retro, it absolutely is. It's just not my favorite design ever. Regardless, the new Suzuki Katana produces 150 horsepower from the great Suzuki 1000cc inline 4, and it weighs around 475 pounds wet, which makes it, in terms of power to weight, one of the fastest motorcycles on this list. It would be higher if it weren't so ugly, in my opinion. I just am not a fan of any of the Katanas. But yeah, pretty quick bike. All right, I would say out of all the bikes on this list that are the least retro, this is probably it. I believe it has a retro aesthetic. Of course, Triumph is going to sell it as sort of a retro bike. It does have the round headlight and the old school looking sort of small fairing, but I know many of you would not consider this a retro bike. I guess it could go either way because for me, I'm not exactly sure what bikes Triumph has in its heritage that they could be pointing to with this bike. I guess maybe when you look at like the race versions of, my bike, for example, the Daytona, when it was actually in race form, had sort of a fairing like this. but so did every bike from that time period. And there's no mention of that, so I don't know. Regardless, it's producing more power than any other bike on this list at 177 horsepower. Of course, if you know much about the Speed Triple, you know that this is built on that platform. It's essentially the same bike, and yeah, it's a monster of a machine. Personally, I would rather have seen Triumph go all in and make a proper super sport or sport bike instead of just dressing up the Speed Triple, which is essentially what this bike is. Also, you're going to have some cash laying around as this thing will run you just under 21K. There's also the other question. Was this bike heavily inspired by another, arguably more interesting, beautiful bike on this list? Maybe. I think so, but that's up for you to decide. And let us know in the comments if you can guess, when the video's over, which one of the bikes this bike seems to be copying. Next, we have the Yamaha XSR 900, essentially the hipster brother to the MT-09, which is a fantastic platform for all you hooligans out there who like a bike like this that is very torquey. In fact, MT stands for Master of Torque. Yeah. The MT-09 is a nutty little engine, so if you're looking for something a bit more peppy than, say, the detuned 900cc Triumph Modern Classics, this is a great option. It's tuned to be more performance-oriented. Aesthetically, it's obviously not going to be for everyone. It seems like most people who want a retro motorcycle want their bike to look a bit older, you know? This thing has some retro design cues, but for the most part, at least to me, it looks like a naked street bike with a round headlight. Oh, and that seat. Ooh, it needs a custom seat. I don't know what's happening there. The XSR 900 produces 117 horsepower and about 70 foot-pounds of torque at around 7,000 RPMs. Yeah, this bike's not for everybody. I probably wouldn't buy it, but it's cool for sure, and I do love all the gold. It looks really nice. Now, this is a bike you don't see very often on the street, at least I don't. And truthfully, I don't know a ton about it. I just think it has a cool aesthetic, and for the price it is, man, it's tough to beat when you consider the fact that it's producing 143 horsepower and it's only $13,000. So basically the same price as a Speed Twin, but obviously it's significantly quicker. Of course, that's not everything. It's just the topic of this video. And also, many aren't going to see this as a very heritage-inspired bike, but whatever you think, this blacked out version that they have currently is sweet. And of course, you're getting a Honda, so it's going to be super reliable. You'll have that nice dealer support. It's essentially a tuned sport bike engine. Not for everybody, but pretty cool bike. All right, next up we have the Kawasaki Z900RS. This is sort of a forgotten retro bike, but at the same time, when you think about performance-inspired retro motorcycles, this is really the bike. First off, it actually does look like a retro bike with some real metal parts, for example. You know, it's got the nice gas tank, and it's just got a more sleek design than, say, the last bike that we talked about. Like, it looks more retro than the Honda. Primarily, this bike points back to the Kawasaki Z900 of the 70s, just a bit thicker though, like most modern classics. It's got to have that huge gas tank. If you guys watch my videos, you know that I don't like that. I wish that they would just make fully sleek bikes, but that might not be possible. This is the engine from the Z900, though it's tuned down a bit more. It produces 111 horsepower at the crank. Everything I see when people ride this bike, they love it. So it's really kind of an overlooked bike, I think, and it's only $11,300. So honestly, one of the best options. You're going to have great support from Kawasaki as a major dealer. So yeah, for those of you that are looking for a bit more affordable but quick, cool bike, this is a great option. Next up, we have the Triumph Thruxton, Triumph's ultimate performance-inspired modern classic, and you'll notice that it's not at number 1. If I were ordering this by actual performance numbers, this list would be completely different. Honestly, there's not much rhyme or reason to the order except number 1. Anyways, the Thruxton is the lightest of the modern classics at just 450 pounds, and it produces a solid 103 horsepower and 83 foot-pounds of torque, low in the rev range, as all the Triumph modern classics do. This is really the thing that's great about these modern classics, is they produce a lot of torque incredibly low in the rev range. So, you know, with all those specs, it's not going to be the fastest on the track, but it's arguably going to be one of the funnest on the street. I love this bike, but my only problem with it is that price, $16,500. Sure, it's spec'd up from the Speed Twin. It's got like the better Brembo brakes. Arguably, the real difference though is the suspension. So if you're into that kind of thing and that really matters for you and for the way that you ride, then of course, save your pennies and get a Thruxton. It's an iconic motorcycle. It's much more performance oriented, but in terms of actual power and torque, I don't know. If that's what really matters, and that is kind of what we're talking about, it doesn't really justify that price gap between the Speed Twin. And personally, I like the look of the Speed Twin more than the Thruxton. All right, runner up on this list goes to the MV Agusta Superveloce, and I've talked about this bike before. Obviously, it's powered by MV's 800cc triple that's present in the Dragster and the Brutale, as well as the F3, and that's really the bike that is the platform for this bike. It's the F3. This is a stylized F3, basically. So it produces 147 horsepower. It's relatively lightweight at around 380 pounds dry. This is up there with some of the fastest bikes on this list. Like, this thing on a track is going to edge out probably the Katana, and it's arguably more track oriented than the Speed Triple RR, but of course makes a little bit less power. Regardless though, for our purposes, yeah, it's performance oriented, but the biggest thing is that overall aesthetic. Now recently, I've been learning about the history of retro Italian motorcycles, like motorcycles that are pointing back to old Italian race bikes, for example, and old Italian iconic bikes. So if you guys want to go full nerd mode on this, there is a podcast that I've watched the entire thing that is amazing. I'll link it down below. It's by BrotoGP, and it's all about the influence of the motorcycle designer Pierre Terblanche. Seriously, check it out in the description below. It is absolutely fascinating, and it goes through how Terblanche essentially predicted the wave of making retro-styled motorcycles. Now, that's a big claim, but he basically created the Sport Classic Ducatis, which are these retro motorcycles from the early 2000s, from around the same time as, when the Bonneville was reintroduced and when the W650 by Kawasaki showed up. And these bikes by Terblanche were essentially retro motorcycles that were made to look like the old Ducati race bikes. And they weren't that popular at the time, but now they're becoming sort of collector bikes. What I'm trying to say is that the Superveloce wasn't created in a vacuum, right? It falls right in line with Italian machines looking back to other Italian machines. And I've had some people say that this bike is not a retro bike, and it is. It absolutely is. They promote it as a retro bike, and it is styled unlike any other sport bike you've ever seen. And what's the difference? Well, it's styled after the old bikes of the GP racing, like the old MV Agustas that were ridden by Agostini, for example, in the 60s. So seriously, go watch that podcast, though. It's super interesting. Again, I've linked it in the description below. And just know, with retro bikes, there's more than just bikes made to look like old British bikes, okay? There's lots of other types of retro motorcycles, like the Indian FTR, for example. But anyways, we need to be more nuanced. That's what I'm trying to say. All right, number one on my list is a bike that, I'm not going to lie, I kind of want. The other day, I actually spent about an hour just seeing what these go for used, as personally, I like the first and second sort of renditions of this bike more than the new 2022 one that was just released. Check out Motobob's video comparing the new one with the previous generation. Anyways, the Speed Twin is an awesome bike by Triumph. It produces just under 100 horsepower. The weight is stripped down quite a bit. Even with that 1200cc lump of an engine, it actually weighs less than the Street Twin, which is the lightest of the 900cc line. For me, this is the bike to get if you want a modern classic that is still very classically designed, but has that extra bit of performance, and really, that's what you're paying for with this bike. When you think about the fact that it's only $2,000 more than a T100, and when you think about what the T100 is compared to what this is, it's a no-brainer. You're getting so much more power. You are getting sort of more details. If you go watch reviews of the Speed Twin, you'll see that there's all these great little details throughout the bike that just aren't on the other bikes, but it still has the dual clocks. It's everything I think that a modern classic should be. Not to knock down the Street Twin or any of those other bikes, but for me, this is the way to go. And I've got to say, the one thing I would do to this bike is, I don't know if this is possible, but I would put a Street Twin tank on the Speed Twin, because I still think that tank is just too thick, and I just don't like it. It's not my thing. So if you could put that slimmer tank on the Speed Twin, that would be amazing. Another great video to watch is Chase on Two Wheels' review of this bike, and he's a sport bike guy, but he found it surprisingly quick. So if you're looking for a cool bike to rip through the canyons, this is the bike if you want something retro. All right, there you guys have it. Those are my picks for the best performance-oriented retro motorcycles that you can buy. Hopefully you guys got some insight if you're looking at this kind of bike. And, if it would be great if you guys would help us out. If there's any great options that you think I missed, put them down in the comments and I'll pin them, if they are ones that I missed. All right, we'll see you guys next time. Ride safe.